Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth, with hosts Doug King and Cody Deese.
Thank you so much. It's great to have every one of you with us, and I hope that everyone out there is having a good day and that all of you have had now 2 or 3 days to recover from Cinco de Mayo. And speaking of Cinco de Mayo, Cody, how in the world are you today?
I'm doing really well. For those that are listening, the time of this recording is May the 8th, 2019.
Yes.
And Cinco de Mayo is behind us. I will say, I am so grateful to the universe for a good margarita.
Oh, yeah. Danae and I say amen, brother.
Although that language, amen, brother, in that world I grew up in, those things were off limits.
Right. Well, this is the way evolution works. The terms, again, evolve in their meanings.
So basically what we're trying to tell you people is you've been asking us for a long time, what is integral theology?
Right.
Well, show me a picture of a margarita and I'll...
That's it.
And by picture, I mean pitcher.
Yes, a pitcher. Well, that's the way we say it in the South. Oh, that's a nice pitcher. That's great.
Oh, my God.
Oh,
okay.
Good.
For those that are just tuning in, we are in a series, and this is part 3. And I want to encourage you to go back to the first 2 and listen. But we're talking about an introduction to integral theology. And this is part 3. But today, Doug, I have a few questions again. So we're setting this up as an interview process, which I have thoroughly enjoyed. So for those of you that are just tuning in or someone told you, hey, you heard about integral theology and you're like, this is interesting. I have the luxury to interview the CEO of Presence International, and they're curating a global conversation for a new earth. Love this organization. We're a nonprofit organization. We contribute to the developmental evolution of individual and collective spiritual consciousness. It's what we do, and it brings me great joy.
Yeah.
Now, that said, today I want to get back into this, and I want to start swinging massive right out of the gate.
Woo.
I want to talk about the wisdom traditions of the world.
Okay.
I want to talk about religions. I want to talk about Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, all of the world religions. I want to talk about interfaith. I want to talk about the biblical narrative, their narratives, trans narrative. And then I want to talk about the future of spirituality. And then if we have time, let's talk about what you believe is happening right now and if we can help move the thing forward.
Wow. That's an agenda, buddy. I love
so for
it.
those of you that want it framed in an outline, there you go.
All we have to do is answer it.
Exactly. No time to waste. Let's jump into this. Doug King.
Yeah.
This is an introduction to integral theology. Question 1. Can religions be integral? Now, before you answer that, there are books floating around. Example, Integral Christianity.
Yeah.
Is that even possible? And then my next question is, how is that different from interfaith communities?
Right.
Or is there a difference?
Right. A great question. And again, we're trying to clarify all these things, not so you're going to agree with us as a listener, but we're again trying to challenge thought here. And so when we talk about a religion, what is a religion? First and foremost, we have to acknowledge that a religion is a form. It's a form-based way of understanding of consciousness. A religion must have boundaries that defines it as such. In other words, I have to know what makes me a Christian, a Buddhist, a Hindu, and all the other religions across the world. And then whether I am that or not that. So it is a statement of amness, which gets back to identity. Religion becomes an identity because we fill in the blank with our religion. I am let's say Christian. That is an identity. That identity, however, is different from the identity of other people who are not of your particular form. And then if you break it down even further, Christianity itself is denominated into tens of thousands. I think it's now over 30,000 denominations that exist. Each one of those is a form that has specific boundaries that delineate it from all other denominations. So you're still using a first-tier consciousness that defines your identity as attached to a specific form. This is what the ego has to have in order for it to have an identity. The ego cannot conceive of an identity apart from some form. And so we have talked about this in the past. When you're talking about the first tier levels and applying them to a theology and to the evolution of your consciousness of theology, you are at the core asking the question, who am I? And in the first tier levels, you're saying, I am a temple worshiper. I am a churchgoer. I am and you fill in the blank with whatever it is of the many constraints, dogmas, creeds, etc., that are part of what make that identity up. So first and foremost, when you're talking about integral Christianity, and don't mean this to be offensive, because the man who wrote that book is, I've heard nothing. I haven't met Paul Smith, who wrote the book, but I understand he's fantastic and has done a tremendous job in his whole life. I'm just expressing my opinion. He has expressed his. To me, integral Christianity becomes an oxymoron. That may sound harsh, but the reason that I'm saying that, from my point of view, is that it's like saying integral particularism, because Christianity is a particularistic religion among many religions. So if I say integral particularism, that to me is an oxymoron. And it again is missing, in my opinion, the point of the God story, that this God who created all, interconnected all, and is all in all, is so much bigger than we have still yet to see. We've already seen that God's big enough to include races and cultures and genders and ethnicities. And so now we're ready to consider whether that God is even bigger than that. And where could we go from here? And what would be the next thing? So to answer the question on religion, yeah, religions are always going to belong to first tier. The question is what level religion are you? Traditional, modern, or postmodern? Because those are the three current levels that religion exists in. Back in the day of Moses, you even had tribal and warrior levels that were involved.
I sometimes sit back and just love listening to you answer these, because I have, if you knew what was in my head right now, a gazillion questions, but awesome. I'm like, stick to the script. Now, I need to, you can't get by with just that, because I need to follow up with this. Okay.
Sure.
The example you just gave, in postmodernity, again, we're talking about integral theology, but we've shifted the conversation a little bit to religions and if they can be integral. That's the question.
Right.
Now, you said integral Christianity would be somewhat of an oxymoron.
Yes.
Okay, now that said, in postmodernity, this is where you begin to see the interfaith collective, the gathering,
right?
The spaces. So, example, we just recently went to a climate change gathering together in Atlanta, and it was fantastic.
It was.
What was represented on the stage was, honestly, I feel like a good portion of the major wisdom traditions.
Yeah, it was.
Were all represented.
Yeah.
And even one of your good friends that came,
yes.
Ken and Sukio Marakari. Did I say that right?
That is very good. Yeah.
Which is, I mean, as he's explained it to me, a beautiful expression.
Yes.
But it's interesting because we all walked out of there thinking this is great as an interfaith gathering, which is a really massive, huge next step for lots of people. I mean, I know people that are in traditional modern stages that are like, goodness, that's massive in itself.
Yeah.
You're saying, but integral even goes beyond that.
Yes.
So what other space is there? What's on the other side of interfaith?
Right. So the prefix INTER, when you look it up, it will say related to form. In other words, you have to have multiplicity of forms to be anything. So interfaith is the relational aspects of different religious forms. So the question then is, what is the nature of God? And for me, when I look at the nature of God, the nature of spirit, it's infinite in every way. It has no boundaries. God, he, she, it. There are no boundaries to spirit. Jesus compares it to the wind. Where does it start? Where does it stop? Everything Jesus has to say about the nature of the Father, that's just a term that shows higher than, someone that is not only all in all, but yet above all, that nature is without boundary. So when we think about, well, then what would my nature be? I'm in the image of God, and I am God breathed. Therefore, I am a mirrored image of that very same amness of identity. What is that amness of identity? It is that which is without boundary. And so when I think, Cody, of what is beyond religion, and we'll have to explain this further when we get into concepts like transnarrative, and we will, because you've already brought it up.
We're headed there next.
Okay. I'll
do the interview.
Yeah, I know. That's your job, the question. That's right. That's right. That's right. Well, that's important.
Stay in your lane.
So I will simply say
stay in your lane.
There's a great commercial where a guy says that. What happens is that you realize then that all human beings have the same God image. All human beings are God breathed. And now the question is, to what degree are each of us conscious of that? And there the human value equation changes immensely, because now we're getting into that infamous word called universality. But I think that universality is a brilliant word when it comes to describing the nature of God. For where is God not? And in what ways is God disconnected from anything, let alone anyone? And so when we start thinking about that, is it possible that we could, on the one hand, absolutely retain Moses and the prophets, absolutely retain Jesus of Nazareth and Jesus the Christ, the unique one who was the firstborn of God? Can we retain all of that and yet at the same time move beyond the concept of that as a religion? And that's where that universal God nature comes in.
And I know for our listeners that's where we have found the crux of the whole situation is.
Yeah.
Because everyone seems to love the idea of integral theology, but when you get into this conversation, it tends to really shock people.
Of course.
And that's where I want to head next, is because I mentioned this because, again, this is an introduction to integral theology. I keep coming back down to that because there's certainly numerous conversations, a myriad of conversations to have about world religions, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure.
But in the context of integral theology, the reason I even bring up a conversation on world religions and wisdom traditions is because they all have their own narrative.
That's right.
And I want to talk about, what does integral theology do with the narrative? And then if you're integrating in its study of God, should you not be integrating all the other narratives? Are you attached to the Bible, specifically the canon that you've been handed? What does integral theology do with all of these narratives?
And you're stepping into the questions now, which we'll answer. But if you're listening right now and alarms are going off in your head, I understand that. And all I can say is that I've walked through these same things, and where I've come out is that first and foremost, I have a higher regard and higher respect for the biblical narrative than I've ever had in my entire life, going back to the time when it was all I used to teach. I went to services 3 times a week and all the things we've talked about in other times. But now that I see this narrative in an integral perspective, Cody, and that it points to the interconnectedness of all of us on this planet as God's children, I have a much higher regard for the biblical narrative than I've ever had. As a matter of fact, when I see it through the lens of the spiral levels and I see the way it unfolded from archaic Adam through tribal Abraham and on up, the narrative frankly amazes me as this collection of writings by different people who existed in different centuries, had no way of collaborating, let alone existing at the same time, and had no technology to know what the other guy was even thinking or writing. So when I start putting these evidences together, my faith goes through the roof that there has to be something behind not just a creator, but a creator who's relational and who communicates to us and has communicated through the way that the narrative unfolds. So in that sense, first and foremost, I see the narrative in a very high and hold a high regard for it. It doesn't mean that I accept all other narratives. I start and come from the biblical narrative, and for me, I look at what is the space to which the biblical narrative points. What is the nature of that space? Well, that's where you get into the end of the narrative, and you're going into the new heaven and earth and the new Jerusalem. And that's why that is so critical and so important to be able to frame correctly, not as something out there in the future, but as something that exists now. The fact that there is no night there, that everything is light, it is enlightenment, awareness, that John did not see a temple there, nor did he see a church building or a mosque or any other type of structure or form. So, and that all nations walk in the light of that. So when I begin to see that the narrative is not explaining anything past that, other than it's saying, you've now entered into a whole new space, a whole new heaven and earth. Everything's become new. Behold, I make all things new. And so everything becomes new. What does that mean? It means I've gone beyond boundaries when it comes to human identity. And so once I'm in that space, now I become a co-creator with God of the future. And that's another conversation. But when we move into that space, we've basically gone trans-narrative, because the narrative has pointed us to this space beyond the narrative itself. The narrative no longer tells us things about where we are in 2019. We're trans-narrative in that sense today. Now, once I look at the aspects of God, if somebody brings me a narrative, Cody, and it says, yes, we have a narrative, and its outcome is that if someone is not a believer, they're to be punished in some way or another, then immediately I'm going to have problems with that particular narrative, because I do not see that at all as the nature of God as I understand it in this biblical narrative. Most narratives, when you start talking to people about Buddhism and Hinduism, what I've found is that there's a tremendous amount of commonality in what those narratives point to. Not that Buddha wanted anyone to become a Buddhist, or the writers of the Upanishads wanted anyone to claim that they were a Hindu, and so on and so forth.
I'm going to stop you right there. Do you think Christ wanted people to be Christians?
No. I think Christ did everything in his power to say, it's not about me. Of myself I can do nothing. Do not glorify me, glorify the Father. The one who sins is greater than the one who is sent. Over and over. I mean, I think when we talk Trinity in a future broadcast, what we're going to see is that it is only in the history of the politics of the 300s in Rome that those things came about. And we've just held on to them, because that's what you do in a traditional mindset. You hold on to whatever your authorities tell you to hold on to, and you defend that. It's been defended now for centuries. So, yeah, in that sense, we have moved to a whole new era, and in this trans-narrative light, if you will, it means that we can question all other narratives. I don't just blindly say, oh, yeah, any narrative is okay. But I do have a higher respect now for the fact that I see God working in people, whether they were in Asia or the Middle East or Africa, Australia, wherever it is. There are narratives that indicate that people are seeing this higher space, if you will. And I think it's time that we started having conversations not about whose narrative we should attach to, but rather, what is it that your narrative is saying about the nature of human connectivity and spirituality and oneness and wholeness? And in that way, I'm not attaching myself to a specific religion, so to speak. Rather, I'm seeing the universal nature of all people and the space in which we live.
That's really interesting. So, and that's been my observation of your work specifically, is you would never call yourself a Biblian, right?
Right.
Because you're not attached to the biblical narrative. It's what you keep saying. It's what the biblical narrative points to.
Yes.
And that's such a huge leap for lots of people, because even like in the world I grew up in, they shifted the Bible in the place of honestly where they put Christ themselves.
Sure.
That's where the whole idea of inerrancy, it's like this perfect thing that you attach to, you grab hold of, and you don't question it, like it's the thing. But what you're saying is no, yet again, this is, what is it pointing to?
Yeah.
And you would say that this is an integral approach for all narratives.
Yes.
That's not attaching to any specific narrative. It's saying, what does this point to?
Yes.
And for you got into the biblical narrative because that's the world you were raised in.
Yes.
And do you believe that if you were raised in the Middle East, it would be a different narrative for you? And do you believe you would have come to some of the same conclusions you have in the biblical narrative?
It's hard to say what conclusions I would have come to, but
I love being the interview.
Yes. But I would say this, and I'd challenge anybody listening to this podcast to run this little paradigm in your own head. Do you really think that if you had been born in Israel, in a specific tribe, Judah, Benjamin, Levi, that you yourself would have thought any differently about God than the Levites and those in Judah and Benjamin thought about God? Because that's what you would have been told, and that's the consciousness level that you would have been given. So if you ask me, would I believe something if I were raised in it? It's most likely that I would. Now, some people move beyond that. So I've talked to people in religions where violence has been brought in the name of their religion, and that's actually spurred them into an unworkable situation in that they believe the nature of all things is love. So I think when we look at that, we have to open up ourselves to the fact that God hasn't abandoned everybody except those of us that seem to, quote, get it. At the same time, it doesn't in any way denigrate what I think about Christ, the narrative, or any parts of this story. It only raises it. So I'd be happy to entertain any questions that people want to email into us to talk about. But I would use that as basic framing.
Okay, 2 more questions before we close.
Okay.
What would you say to those who are within particular religious forms that are trying to change it from within? Can religions evolve? Maybe a better way to frame this, or a second question, would be, what do you believe the future of world religions and spirituality looks like?
So if I start with Christianity, I would simply say that wherever you are, you're listening to this podcast and you're considering these things, you are in a great place, whatever denomination you belong to, whatever church you're going to, from the standpoint that you are seeking, you're asking, and you're knocking. That's what Jesus is saying is a key to growth. Seek, ask, and knock. I'm not saying that you're agreeing with what I'm saying. You may see aspects of integral in your particular denomination. You may believe that you are an integral Christian or an integral denomination. I'm not going to argue that with you because that's your perspective. So first and foremost, I'm not here to alarm anybody about getting out of their denomination or where they're supposed to be at this time in their life. The second thing is, it seems to me that the way movements happen is that different people in different places begin to find their particular situation too restrictive, and that onesie-twosie people believe or begin to leave their particular groups, and it usually doesn't happen that an entire group moves at the exact same time. So what you may find as somebody listening to this podcast is that you're already thinking things that are outside the boundaries of the place where you go to church right now, but you may not be ready to leave that church. Then you should stay there until you are. This, you see, if God is all in all, and if God really is interconnected, and we can't change that because death has been defeated, and that means separation doesn't exist today and can't exist today. It just simply means that you're in your process wherever you are, and you have a right to be where you are. And so from that standpoint, we're giving podcast ideas out here for those who may want to share with us, Cody, and we've got a lot of people, but they're onesie-twosie all over, literally all over the planet, because when a new movement starts, there's just a 1% or even less than 1% that has to start that movement before it turns into 2-3% and finally reaches tipping points later on.
Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting to me is how I am observing people that are all over the spectrum of conversation, but that are walking away from religion, but they're walking away from so many different reasons of why,
Right.
and they're not walking into something. It feels like they're just walking away from something, which I guess
Yeah.
inevitably will be a great step.
Oh, yeah.
But it's, well, where are you headed? And that's
Sure.
what I want to ask you about the future of spirituality. Do you envision a world where there are no religions?
Yeah, it's funny. I think about that song by Lennon all the time. Imagine there's no religion. No, no heaven, no hell, no religion too. It's funny. What was in John Lennon's head when he said imagine? It's hard for us to imagine that things would be any different than they are today. If we have lived with the Berlin Wall all our lives as a boundary, it's just so difficult to imagine that that thing could ever come down. If there was a wall between Jews and Gentiles, it was impossible for them to imagine that those walls could come down. And so on and on I go with history. And I think the biggest problem for me is to constantly challenge what I believe God has to be confined to, and what I believe we as humans have the potential to do. And I am very optimistic about the future. And I believe the chaos and the pain that we are in today is simply creating a situation so unworkable that it's going to cause us to pull together and come together. And the more that happens, Cody, I think the more that we'll begin to look for solutions beyond denominated, religiated separations, just as we have in all other aspects of our lives.
So do you believe we're at a critical time in history? Do you believe this evolutionary shift to integral is happening right now? And how can we help move it forward?
There's no doubt it's happening. We're talking about it, so it's on the planet. It exists because you and I are saying it. We're talking about it. How we move it forward, we do our best to simply grow ourselves personally, join in these kinds of conversations, and be there for other people and support other people who are struggling with questions within their denomination and are not sure where to go, just making sure that they understand that's okay to struggle. It's okay to have questions, and it's okay not to know. And then we'll have numerous other ways that Presence is going to provide conferences and meetings and other opportunities online, hopefully, that this movement can have a place where people can go to, not just leave something, but go to.
Okay, people. That is an introduction to integral theology, part 3. Next week, I want to get into individuals, and then I want to get into collectives and how we view them from an integral stage. So that's what we'll jump into. Thanks for joining us. Again, hope you have a fantastic week. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.